maybe I should say konnichiwa, because I'm going to take you to Japan today. Some of you requested something about the samurais, and this is going to be an introduction to their history. Of course, we all know at least a bit about the samurais. They are very famous icons of Japanese history and culture. They have sometimes been compared to the medieval knights from Europe. And I would like to tell you about how they appeared, about the role they played in the history of Japan, how they finally disappeared, and what remains of them in today's world. To begin with and understand the context in which the first warriors, known as samurais, appeared, we need to talk about the history of Japan. And you may know that Japan is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, monarchy in the world. There has been an emperor as the head of state in Japan for at least 15 centuries. The first writings originating from Japan that we know are relatively recent in comparison with other cultures and civilizations of the world. They are dated from the 8th century of our era. But Japan had been populated long before that, several millennia before. For example, there are traces of a culture in Japan called the Jomon culture that appeared about 3 millennia before Christ and lasted for about 2000 years. For centuries, and especially in the first centuries after the appearance of the imperial institution in Japan, the country was highly influenced by China. I already talked about that in various videos, but it's always important to remember that for several East Asian countries like Korea, like Vietnam or Japan, China has been like a cultural matrix from which political conceptions, religions, cultural habits came from and were adapted locally. And then there are still remains of that. For example, the Japanese writing system, the kanjis, is adapted from the Chinese system. I told you before that there had been emperors, or mikados as they are called in Japan, for about 1500 years. But actually during most of the history of Japan, their power was more symbolic than anything, and they were politically and militarily weak, having to face many civil wars between clans, between noble families, and bit by bit, with their power declining, they had to delegate the government and the political authority to a military governor called the shogun, who was the actual governor or dictator ruling the country in the name of the emperor, and the emperor, the Mikado, was confined and limited to a symbolic role as the head of state. And in fact, from the 12th century to the 19th century, when the so-called Meiji era started, and when Japan began to modernize and westernize, the actual ruler of the country was the shogun. And in this system of shogunate that lasted for about 7 centuries, this status was transmitted from father to son, with powerful dynasties ruling the country, sometimes for several centuries. The most famous of these dynasties of shoguns were probably the Tokugawas, who ruled Japan from the 17th to the 19th century. And until the 19th century, with the Meiji reform, Japan had a feudal type of society and political organization. It is called feudal in comparison with Europe in the Middle Age, because the political structure of Japan was very similar in a sense. It was based on a pyramid of allegiance, with symbolically the emperor at the top, delegating the reality of power to a shogun, and the shogun commanded to local nobles that actually ruled every region of the country. In this pyramid or chain of allegiance, the bushis, the warriors, and their elite that would become the samurais. Samurai in Japanese means the one who serves, and the samurai would become a special caste, a special group within this social organization that can be compared with the European knights in a sense, because they belonged to the little nobility, serving a master. The master could be the shogun himself, or a local noble, what the Japanese called a daimyo, a master. And their importance started to grow during several centuries of civil wars and competition between various powerful clans trying to take control of the shogunate. But the samurais, as we know them, would actually flourish from the beginning of the 17th century only, with their code of conduct and their special weapons, their very codified social status by peacetime, after the end of the civil wars. Because, as I indicated before, at the beginning of the 17th century, the Tokugawas took control of the shogunate and managed to maintain a period of peace internally from the very beginning of the 17th century to 1868 with the Meiji era. So for more than 2 centuries and a half, the samurais would serve their masters as a military elite. They were assigned a role of protection of their masters because it was now peacetime, but in this period of peace they maintained military values and values that were strongly influenced by where they came from, this period of constant war, when military values, the sense of sacrifice, courage, the absence of fear were highly praised, and they would maintain this and even push it further in this Tokugawa era. The code of conduct that the samurais had to respect, also called the Bushido, was written and elaborated during this period of peace, and the samurais adopted various external signs of the caste they belonged to. They abandoned their armors, these very famous medieval Japanese armors that they replaced by the kimono. They also adopted a particular haircut with parts of their skull shaved to immediately show everyone to which social group they belong to. The weapons they wore were also codified. Their set of weapons was called the daisho, and it was a privilege of the samurais to be allowed to have it. And the daisho is a set of 2 sabers, one long saber called the katana and one shorter. Firearms were prohibited not only for the samurais but for the entire Japanese population, and interestingly they had been prohibited by the Tokugawas after their victory over competing clans to control the shogunate. And I'm saying interestingly because the Tokugawas used firearms in the final battle when they defeated their opponents. But after that, we have a rare example of a country that banned firearms for 2 centuries and a half and decided to isolate itself from the rest of the world and to reject any kind of external influence on its population. It is surprising for us to see a technical innovation, and especially one that is particularly efficient, like firearms, to be abandoned in a country, and to see this ban respected for such a long time. In that case, the ban was justified by the fact that firearms were very deadly and were also considered dishonorable weapons because they could kill a very brave warrior without leaving him any chance. But this kind of debates or opposition to new weapons actually also appeared in the Western world various times. For example, in the Middle Age in Europe, there was a controversy when the first crossbows appeared, because these kind of weapons were extremely efficient, much more than traditional bows. A man with just a few days of practice could become more accurate and more dangerous than a very experienced bowman. And also the crossbows made it possible at a distance to kill a warrior or a knight despite his armor, and this was considered also a very dishonorable way of making war, so that even the Catholic Church officially banned crossbows, a ban that was actually never respected. And this debate or this controversy about the dishonorable nature of weaponry came back regularly with technical innovation, with firearms, and later on with weapons like submarines. The first submarines were used in the 19th century and were seen initially as a very vicious way of destroying enemy ships without giving the crew any chance, or gases, war gases, at the beginning of the 20th century. And even today, with weapons like drones, the debate goes on. But despite this opposition in the Western world, every time an innovation in weaponry proved efficient enough, it has been adopted, maybe because several countries were at war, and the efficiency of their weaponry was more important than in the case of Japan, that could live isolated. Maybe also because the status of technical progress was seen differently in the West. But actually we have a rare example of Japan during the Tokugawa era, of a country successfully banning weapons that are more efficient than the weapons it uses. However, this ban gave a chance to the art of white weaponry in Japan to flourish, and the blades, the steel blades made for the katanas and other arms used by the samurais, were of an exceptional quality, thanks to the know-how developed in Japan. They may be the most balanced and deadly blades ever made by the hand of man, and still today the weapons, the ancient weapons used by samurais, are not only antiques and a testimony of the past, they are also exceptional crafts that are treasured by the Japanese as part of their national heritage. Another ritual of the samurais that is very famous and impressive was called the Seppuku. And the Seppuku is for a samurai when he is dishonored or at risk of being dishonored, a way by killing himself to save his honor. In this seppuku, self-execution ritual, the samurai uses the shortest of his two blades to open his belly, and a person of confidence, generally his best friend, was here to immediately after cut his head. And by this ritual, the samurai could entirely wash his name and avoid the dishonor that would have otherwise tarnished it. I think it's interesting here too to make a parallel with what happened in Europe with the knights, because the development of this status of the samurai in Japan took place by peacetime, when the civil wars had already ended, and in a sense the same thing happened in Europe at the end of the Middle Age and the beginning of the Renaissance in Europe, when firearms and the artillery especially made the knights less and less useful and efficient on the battlefields. They had become a bit obsolete. But the end of the Middle Age and the 16th century of the Renaissance in particular correspond to the moment when the values of chivalry, the ideals that the knights were supposed to represent, were praised more than ever. At the court of Henry VIII in England, Francis I in France, Charles V from Habsburg in Austria and Spain, the values, the ideals of chivalry were revered more than ever at a time when they already belonged to the past. And in a sense, the same happened with the samurais. It is by peacetime, when they were essentially needed for police missions and not large-scale conflicts, that the samurais appeared as a caste and pushed even further the military ideals of courage and sacrifice that characterized these people. But by the second half of the 19th century, the era of samurais suddenly come to an end with the shogunate and feudal Japan during the Meiji Restoration. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate was eliminated, and the emperor that had been for centuries essentially a symbolic ruler of the country regained control of Japan, beginning a period of modernization and opening of Japan to the world. And the feudal bases of ancient Japan were quickly abandoned or changed form. In 1869 there was a major reform of the social organization in Japan, impulsed by the imperial power this time, and various classes were created, four of them especially. There was the imperial family, that was one, the ancient nobility that came after in the hierarchy. The third one was the ancient class of the samurais, and finally the vast majority of the people. And quickly the samurais were forbidden to go out with their double saber. They were forbidden to have this particular haircut that distinguished them from the rest of the population, and they had to integrate the new structures of Japan. They joined the police or the army, and as a class they disappeared, but they participated to the reforms and the transformation of Japan that had begun in the 1870s, and that were going to make it an industrial power, and also in the last years of the 19th century and the early 20th century, a regional power that would start to expand outside, as opposed to its strategy of remaining a closed country during the Tokugawa era. And because they were educated, the samurais also participated in the creation of very large companies that would begin the industrial development of Japan. And it is believed by some sociologists that through this integration of the class of the samurais, some of their values of dedication, sense of sacrifice, of excellence, the importance of honor and victory, which has to be achieved whatever the cost, and the cost may mean death. These values continued to survive in Japan, and this ancient class of the samurais, as defined by the reform of 1869, would only be abandoned, abolished in 1947 in the new constitution that Japan adopted after the Second World War, when for the first time in its history it became a democracy. Okay, there could be many more things to say, but I've been speaking for about half an hour, so I'm going to stop now. And as always, I hope you found this moment interesting, relaxing maybe, and that I'll see you soon for another topic. As usual, your requests and